I bet a whole bucket of wings that we've all been in this situation before. You're out on the water and the fish are eating. Maybe they're smacking dry flies, or you're watching folks up and down river from you hooking to fish on nymph rigs. It's fantastic, except for one thing. You're not catching any fish. You've thrown your entire fly box at the river and you're about ready to take the skunk, go home, and do something simpler like linear algebra. But what if I told you there's a relatively simple process to troubleshoot your way through those tough days on the water? I've been fly fishing for over 20 years and I've been skunked plenty. Over the years, though, I've learned a few things that I can do when I'm faced with a tough day. These are the steps I follow to put fish in the net, and more often than not, they work. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Peter from Connecticut sent in a question a while ago that inspired the open for this week's show. I'm going to go ahead and read his entire question. He wrote in and said, "Hey guys, just started following the podcast. Great stuff. I'm a newbie in the world of fly fishing, having been out 6 to 7 times now and navigating my way through the tough learning curve bit by bit. I recently had an entire weekend out on Connecticut's Farmington River and was skunked all weekend, but the fish were actively rising. Lots of different insect species hatching, and in desperation, I threw practically my entire fly box at them to no avail. Forgive me if it's been asked before, but what's a good process of elimination to go through when the fish are feeding, just not your flies? I matched as well as I could to what I saw, a lot of flying ants actually, but again, no take." Peter, this is a great question. We've all been in that situation before. I just was a couple of days ago, actually, and I'm going to tell that story here in a minute. But like I mentioned to start the show, I've got a little bit of a troubleshooting process that I go through in situations like this, and I've had a lot of practice of standing on the water and not catching fish. So the longer you fly fish, the more days you will have where you just go through it and don't catch very many or don't catch anything at all. Sometimes it will happen. So you'll be able to develop your own process like what I've got here. And I'm going to tell a story to illustrate how this process works. If you're new to Untangled or to VFC in general, I tell a lot of stories because I think it's a little bit better way to teach things than me just droning on here like a professor. But the key thing to remember is the process I'm going to illustrate. It's the same ideas, the same principles behind this process apply to any type of fly fishing you're doing. So if you're throwing dry flies or nymphs or streamers or whatever you're doing, the steps I'm going to outline, this troubleshooting process, it's the same because even though your rigs and your tactics might change, the principles behind them don't. So a couple of days ago, literally the day before I sat down to start working on this episode of Untangled, I'm out on the water. The weather was absolutely perfect. There were some mayflies hatching. There were some midges, and it's been so warm here lately. Really, really warm start to winter. It doesn't bode well for next year, but I'm kind of not complaining right now. It's nice to not be freezing. But all the ingredients were there for an absolutely perfect day, and I was expecting to do really well. It just felt like a fishy day. Sometimes you feel that. You get out there and it just feels like something good's going to happen. So I pull up to the river and I rigged up a scud, and then I had an egg and then a larger stonefly nymph that served as my attractor and then also as my weight to get my flies down deep. Now, I mentioned that there were midges and mayflies hatching. So I chose this rig because I didn't see any fish rising to those hatching midges and mayflies. But since the bugs were hatching, that told me the fish would probably be active unless I saw or observed otherwise. So I didn't really expect them to be keyed in on anything specific, which is why I went with this different rig, because fish will be opportunistic in the winter and eat those eggs and those scuds. And then that stonefly nymph is just there to serve as my weight, as my attractor as well. But the first hole that I fished didn't give up any fish. I fished it well. I covered the water thoroughly. I adjusted my depth. I did everything. I prayed to the fish gods. I was standing in the right direction. I hadn't had any wings recently though, so maybe that was throwing me off. But I did have Diet Coke on the way to the river, so I'd covered literally all of my bases. But again, I was keeping an eye out for the rising fish just in case they had keyed in on something, and that would tell me, oh, I need to switch to a midge rig or I need to switch to a mayfly rig. But there was just nothing going on. Nothing. It felt like it was a big empty river. So I skipped to another hole because I assumed the fish in that first one just didn't want to play, but it was the same story. Really good water, what I felt like were good presentations, things I had confidence in, and then no fish. That forced me to go to another spot, and I told myself at this point that I would finally change my flies if I didn't catch anything in a half hour. I just set a time limit because I had already been fishing for a couple hours at this point, so I said, okay, I probably need to start thinking about changing these flies. Now, I was being stubborn with my fly choice because I know this river. I know what the fish eat, and I mistakenly assumed, in a little bit of arrogance, that I had it all dialed in, that I knew everything going into this. Well, an hour goes by and no fish. So I finally gave in and I clipped off that scud. It was my bottom fly. I tied on a squirmy worm. Literally second cast, I throw it out there and I put an 18-inch rainbow in the net. So what's the process here? What steps did I follow? And that rainbow, by the way, it's the only fish I caught all day. So this day that I thought was going to be really fishy ended up as a one fish day. I'm not complaining. I'm just pointing it out. That happens. And it happens to all of us. Okay. It will. So again, what's the process? Because it wasn't super clear, maybe, especially if you're new to fly fishing. What steps did I follow to go from getting skunked for the first 2.5 hours to finally putting a fish in the net almost at the buzzer? Well, there are 5 parts to this process, and I didn't come up with anything unique or revolutionary here. There's nothing proprietary here, although maybe I should claim that it is so I look smart. I could finally have something like that. But honestly, a lot of this troubleshooting stuff, a lot of this process, it's just stuff that I've observed from the best anglers that I've fished with. I've got one buddy of mine. He says that he has not been skunked in the 21st century. Now, he and I used to fish together a ton, and he never got skunked when we were out on the water together. So I don't really have any reason to doubt him, but that's still a pretty big claim to make, that he never has been skunked since the year 2000. Well, I learned a few things from him, but then I've also learned a few things on my own. And this is the process. This is what I did the day before I sat down to start working on this show. Like I said, 5 steps. So number 1 is you've got to set up a rig that you're confident in. So first step, you get to the river, you need to be fishing with something that you believe in, something you've got faith in, because you will fish better when you have confidence in your flies. It's a mental thing, but it's 100% true. Because there's this river that I love to go fish. And I used to fish it. I used to live a lot closer to it. I don't live as close to it as now as I used to. And there was a stretch where I think I fished, every rig that I fished on that river had a zebra midge on it for probably close to 3 years. Because the biggest fish I've caught on that river came on a zebra midge. A 25-inch rainbow ate a zebra midge. So if anybody tries to tell you that those giant fish don't eat little bugs, well, that's just not true, because that 25-inch rainbow did eat a little size 18 zebra midge. But I fished that zebra midge because I was so confident in it there, because it produced so well for me. There's tons of midges, and I could almost always count on it. So my rigs always had a zebra midge on them. Now, I finally branched out a little bit on that river and tried a few different things, but for a long time, that was my safety net, and I felt very confident in using that zebra midge because it had produced so well for me. And the same thing can happen for you. You probably have, if you've been doing this for any length of time at all, you've probably got a collection of flies that you feel very confident in that just produce for you no matter what. And that kind of leads us down that rabbit hole of thinking, well, maybe there's a magic bullet, a silver bullet type fly that works all the time. And we know that there's not, because the aquatic insect activity varies throughout the year. What the fish want to eat changes day by day. Sometimes it feels like it changes minute by minute. And there's no one fly that will work 24/7, 365. But there are flies that you're going to fish and feel confident in because they produce for you. And the more you fish, the more you'll develop that collection of flies. So that's your first step to this process is you need to get to the river and rig up with something that you feel confident in. And part of that is you want to make sure that you are basing your rig. And this is step number 2 is you got to rig up with something you're confident in. But step number 2 is base your rig on what you know about the water plus what you see on the river that day. So thinking back to this experience a couple of days ago, I was confident in my rig, but I based that rig on what I knew about the river already, which is that the fish there love scuds and really turn to scuds in the winter. I've got a couple of buddies who fish this river even more than I do, and they're always fishing scuds, and they're pulling some nice fish out on scuds. So I know a scud is a great option, especially in the winter when the rest of the aquatic insect activity has died down. A scud's going to be a great option. There's also a lot of brown trout in the river as well. So I went with an egg because the browns had just finished up their spawning. So the fish would probably still move to eat some eggs. It wouldn't be fast and furious action, but you'd still probably catch a few on it as well. And then that point fly was a solid choice as well because this river does have a ton of stoneflies in it. So that should at least get the fish's attention. Even if they don't move to eat it, they'll see it and they'll think, oh yeah, there's stoneflies in here. So to get to this point yourself, where you can base your rig on what you know about the water plus what you see, requires two steps, in my opinion. You've got to just spend more time on the water. That's going to be your best educator. That's going to be your best teacher, is spending as much time on the water as you can. But if you can't always get out on the water, which I know very few people who can get on the water as much as they want. And even those folks, I don't think they're out as much as they want to be. It's just a fact of life. You can never fish as much as you would like to. But anyways, if you can't be out on the water as much, then you can talk to fly shops or you can study up on some hatch charts for your area. And then when you are on the water, just pay a lot of attention to what's going on when you're out there, because that's going to help you build up a library of information that you can use at any time of the year. That's also why I think it's so important to get out and fish in the middle of winter and to fish all throughout the year if your local regulations allow it, because again, that's going to build up more experiences, more information for you that you can turn to when you run into issues with catching some fish. So that is step number 2. Step number 3, the third thing that I did was I had that rig ready and then I fished it in a variety of water and I changed my presentation as I went. Okay, this matters a lot because the fish won't always be in the same piece of water every single time. And what I mean by that is sometimes you're going to find them right on the seams. Other times they're going to be in the pools. Other times they'll be in the riffles. Other times they'll be in the runs. Sometimes they will be everywhere and it feels like every single cast you throw is good. And those days are magical and wonderful. And they feel about as good as a perfectly crisp wing dipped in just the sauce that's just tangy enough and just spicy enough to give you that little zap of remind you you're alive. But kidding aside, those days are kind of rare, but the fish aren't always in the exact same type of water, even within a couple of days. Sometimes they just move around. And even if they are in the same piece of water, they might be a little bit deeper or they might be a little bit higher in the water column. So you've got to always be adjusting. ABA is the acronym I use. I introduced that on the show a couple of weeks ago, I think. I can't remember. It's been a minute. But you always want to be adjusting your presentation. And with a nymph rig like what I was using, that really comes down to adjusting my depth. So changing my depth if I'm not catching fish, getting those flies on the bottom so that I'm just ticking along the bottom. I'm not snagging up every single cast. I'm snagging maybe every 4 or 5 casts. And that tells me, okay, my flies are down deep enough. I'm where the fish should be. And then if I'm not getting anything, maybe I change the depth again. Maybe I focus on a different type of water. I was fishing a lot of seams, and when that didn't work, after about the first 45 minutes, I started fishing the deeper stuff, the pools. I'm focusing on that instead of the seams so much. So again, you're going to have to play around with this, but you want to always be adjusting until you find where the fish are. Once you figure that out, just repeat that until you stop catching fish and then continue to adjust. But once you find where the fish are, don't keep adjusting after that. You're just going to get frustrated if you do that. Continue to work on it. Continue to change and to adjust only if you're not catching fish. When you get into fish, just leave it and try and repeat that as much as you can. So that's step number 3. Step number 4, I fished the rig long enough to realize that it wasn't working. Now, I didn't wait just 15 minutes and decide to change. This is a common misconception that a lot of folks have. I see it a lot with beginners as well, is that there's some magic time limit out there that you need to go fish your flies for 15, 20, 23 minutes, 23 and a quarter minutes or whatever it is. And then once you hit that time limit, change your flies if they're not working. It's instant and it's mechanical and it's repeatable like that. That's what a lot of folks think, but that's not true. That's just not the reality of it, because what you should do is you need to fish that rig in a few different spots, and then you want to get as many perfect drifts as you can. And if you've repeatedly got great drifts, stuff that you think, man, if Durant was here, he'd pat me on the shoulder and say, well done, young grasshopper. You want drifts like that, all right, where you feel really good about them, where you think, I can't believe that didn't catch a fish. There's no drag. They're at the right depth. It just looks good, it feels good, and most importantly, you feel confident in it. You want as many of those as possible in a few different pieces of water before you even think about switching your rig up, okay? You have to give those flies time to work because, again, you want to cover water until you figure out where the fish are. Now, when you go to make your fly change, if you've done it for the rule of thumb, if you have to have one, I would say fish your rig, get perfect drifts in 3 different holes. And if you've done that and nothing's going on, then I think you could easily say, all right, I've done it in 3 spots. I'm going to go ahead and change my flies up. Well, when I decide to change flies, what I do is I go to something else that should work. So, for example, I'm not going to throw a hopper on in January just for the sake of switching flies. Okay, as much fun as it would be to catch a fish on a hopper in January, it's just not very realistic. The latest I've ever caught a fish on a hopper was November, and that was one of the warmer winters I've ever experienced, and that was back when I still lived in Utah. So, but again, change it to something that should work. Now, often what I'll do is I'm just going to switch the color or size of a fly first. So I'm not even going to change the pattern. I'm just going to change the color and the size first, because sometimes it really is that simple. So I'll go to a red zebra midge instead of a black one, and I'll go to a 20 instead of a size 18. Just little adjustments like that, because sometimes that really will make the difference, especially this time of year. Those tiny, tiny adjustments can make the difference in the winter and in the early spring when the fish are still feeling really lazy, and you've got to just get a really, really solid match, really get it right in front of them to get them to eat a lot of the times. Now, sometimes I will go with an entirely new fly. Let's say it's middle of the summer, and I've got a parachute Adams on, and I've got a mayfly nymph underneath that. And if the fish aren't liking that at all, then I will switch the rig out completely and go to some caddis stuff just to see if they want some caddis, because it's the summer and mayflies are hatching, but we've also got caddis going on. There's a lot of bug activity, and sometimes they'll get picky and just want the caddis or just want the mayfly. So that's when I'll make my wholesale fly changes and switch the whole rig out completely. But again, the key is just to change your flies to something that's still reasonable for when and where you're fishing. And that goes all the way back to step number 2, where you've got to base your rig on what you know about the water plus what you see on the water that day. You've got to have that library of experiences you can draw on to inform your fly choice. And whether that's time on the water or talking with folks in the fly shops or studying hatch charts, you've got to build that library information up somehow. So that's a non-negotiable. You've got to have some information. Otherwise, you're really just going to be standing in the river waving a stick. All right. Now, Step number 5. The other thing that I did is I made just one small change to my fly choice, basing it on the knowledge of the river and observation. So this dovetails right in with step number 4. But when I finally caved and when I finally changed my scud, I cut that scud off and put a worm on. I made that change actually because I stopped in a fly shop on the way down. I was out of a couple of things. And the guy there said worms were working well. So I picked a few up because I didn't have any worms. I also went with a worm because, again, this is a great time of year to fish worms. The aquatic insects are not as active. So your caddis, your mayflies, your stoneflies, they're not going to be moving until the spring. Midges are the only insect that's doing a whole lot of anything. And then you've got your scuds, your sow bugs, your worms, and your eggs that'll work throughout the winter because those are really the only highly available food item other than the midge. So the fish are going to be looking at those. It's also important, again, I just want to drive this home. Don't make immediate wholesale changes to your rig because those little one fly changes or even just changing the color, that will help. That's going to help troubleshoot exactly what the fish are keyed in on. And I've got a story to illustrate this for you. So there's this river here that Alex and I love to fish, and we fished it 5-6 times this summer, I think. We got up there and we would always, between both of us, we always had some sort of stonefly nymph on our rig all summer long because we knew that the fish would eat them. And there's so many stoneflies on that river that to not have a stonefly nymph on would just be ludicrous. Now, we would change out other flies, but we always kept that stonefly nymph as a constant, and then we would switch our other flies out around that. And I honestly don't think there was a single time when we had a great day on the water that we didn't have a stonefly nymph on the rig at some point. So hopefully that just drives these points home, and hopefully this process makes sense. It really is all about just observe, make small changes. Observe, make small changes, and continue to do that. The more time you spend on the water, the more observation you make, the more information you're going to have to help you when you get into situations like this. And it's also helpful, I'll just end with this. It's also helpful to not get flustered and not get down. This used to happen to me all the time. We'd be out on the water and I'd not catch fish for 2 or 3 hours. And I would start, the crippling self-doubt would come in. Almost like hearing my mom tell me, you're not good enough. It felt that same way where you just start thinking that every cast is awful and it just feels like a chore and the joy of being out there is gone. Try to keep that at bay as much as you can. If you feel that creeping in, just step out of the water for a sec, recalibrate it, and ask yourself, all right, what's the point? What am I trying to do here? I'm trying to put flies in front of fish and make them look natural. That's my goal. And maybe I've gone off the deep end on my rig. Let's go back to the basics. Okay, it's the winter. Let's throw a scud. Let's throw a midge on. Let's throw a worm on, and let's go. Let's keep it simple. Okay, recalibrate. Kind of don't get too high or too low on these adjustments, and certainly don't get too high or too low on yourself. So hopefully that helps. And if you've got any questions about this process, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to explain more if you need more information about it. And that's going to wrap up the open of the show this week, folks. But don't go anywhere because we've got the Q&A section coming right up.
Anglers are always asking, what bugs are hatching right now? And that's why we put together a year-round hatch chart. It outlines all the major bug hatches so you always know what fly to tie on, no matter where you're fishing or what time of the year. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this free hatch chart. All right, back to the show.
Every week, we dedicate half the show to answering questions directly from viewers and listeners just like you, and often the questions you submit become the basis for the open of the show as well, as we just saw. There is a link to submit your questions in the show notes. Please keep those coming, folks. I love to get and read all of your questions. And the first question this week Comes to us, Zachary from Oregon, writes in and says, "Hey guys, I've been fly fishing for about 6 months now, and I have a hard time setting the hook on dry flies this summer. I've been able to catch a few, but 90% of the time, I feel like I've been ripping it out of their mouth. I've tried setting the hook immediately, and I've tried waiting 1 to 2 seconds, then setting it. What am I doing wrong? Any advice is much appreciated. Also, Barks root beer is superior. Love the show." Hey, Zach, good question. Man, it has been forever since I've had a root beer. I might have to go get myself one today. That actually sounds kind of good. Oh, well, from the sounds of it, without seeing you fish, just what it sounds like you're setting the hook too hard. It's not when you're setting so much as it is how much force you're actually using. And this is a common mistake, especially if you're making the move over to fly fishing from conventional fishing, where you do tend to put a lot more force into the hook set. With fly fishing, especially with dry flies, your hook set just needs to be a firm lift straight up with your dry flies. Just keep the line tight, lift your rod firmly, move it quickly, but not too quickly. And I know it sounds like I'm telling you Goldilocks stuff here, right? Well, not too hot, not too cold. It's got to be just right. It really is that way. You want a good firm lift. And that lift is key, because if you snap your wrist too much or too hard, that's when you will notice that you're setting the hook too hard. And Alex actually has got a little story to share about this. He was looking through this show before I sat down to record, and he said, "Oh, you got to tell people about this." So Alex's example here is what not to do. He calls this his signature move sometimes. He was on a still water a couple of months ago. I think he was out there with his father-in-law, and he was grinding for like 5 hours one morning. And there's this big chironomid hatch going on, and he could see these cruisers, just giant rainbows going everywhere, but they were so picky. It was nearly impossible to not spook these fish. He went through every tiny dry fly he had in his box. He worked his butt off, and then he finally gets down to a size 22 parachute Adams or parachute blue winged olive, pardon me, with a 5X 12-foot leader. And he army crawls into position to make the cast without spooking the fish. And he sees this big rainbow, thinks it's like a 20-incher, swimming right towards me. Right towards him. Sorry. He puts the fly right in front of that fish, and it's a slow motion rise, just like straight out of a movie, where the fish just comes up, it crushes the dry, everything that the dreams are made of. And what does Alex do? He set the hook like he was fishing for tarpon, and he snaps the tippet and ended up getting skunked. And he's not bitter about it at all. But situations like that happen, and you can get too excited. So avoid doing what Alex did. Don't set too hard. And then remember as well that the only thing that should move during your hook set is your arm. If you're twisting your entire body and you're pulling at the same time that you set the hook, you're going to pull the fly right out of the fish's mouth. Again, it's not necessarily the timing, although that does matter, and that is important. But it sounds like your particular issue, Zach, is the force that you're using to set the hook. So even on big fish, I set the hook the same as I do on the small fish, with just a firm lift straight up. So hopefully that helps. Thanks for sending your question on in. Alex from Connecticut has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey, Spencer, longtime listener, first-time caller. Love the pod. I am fairly new to fly fishing, and I was wondering, is there any situation in which I shouldn't be tying on a dry dropper besides using streamers? Being a newbie, I'm thinking, wouldn't this cover my bases? Double my chances with the dry for risers and a nymph for the water column? Or even when they aren't rising, the dry is an indicator and the hopes that they take the nymph? Or am I potentially establishing bad habits / being too narrow-minded thinking this way? Thanks." Well, Alex, this is a great question, and I really like the way you're approaching this too, where you're constantly questioning your approach. That's a good thing to do, and all the best anglers I know do that, where they're constantly being critical of how they're doing what they're doing and why they're doing it. So that's a good skill to have. But I'm going to answer your question with a question. I love to do this. What are you trying to achieve while you're out there on the water? What's your goal as a fly angler? You're trying to put your flies in front of fish and make your flies look as real as possible. That's your goal. So a dry dropper accomplishes that, like you pointed out, because you can cover 2 parts of the water column. And yep, even if they aren't actively rising, then that dry fly is a great indicator for when they eat the nymph. Sometimes I'll even use that dry fly in the middle of winter as an indicator. I used to fish one river back when I lived down in Utah. I would fish and I would have a big foam ant up top, and then a scud, and then a zebra minge underneath it. Because that ant was so sensitive, and the takes in this river in the winter were so soft and subtle that short of Euro nymphing, this is the best way to feel and to see the takes. And a lot of the times it was just a little too, the distances were too great to make Euro nymphing or tight lining all that feasible. So I went with this rig, and it worked great. So yeah, it will work as an indicator, that dry fly will, just like you mentioned. So as long as you apply that mindset and that approach and that process to whatever water you're fishing, then you're going to be fine. Get your flies in front of fish, get those flies to look as realistic as possible. That is your goal. Sometimes that means that you're going to need a double nymph rig fished very deep instead of a dry dropper, especially this time of year in the winter. Nymphs fish deep, streamers, that's going to be your best bet. Other times, it's going to mean that you want that dry dropper rig. And honestly, that's going to be a majority of the year, because when aquatic insects are active and the fish are looking up and they're actively eating, that's a majority of the year. And majority of our fishing happens during those warmer, more pleasant months. So a dry dropper is a great thing to use the majority of the time. It's what I use the majority of the time. I really only get over to nymph rigs here in the middle of winter. But and then again, other times you might want a double dry fly rig because the fish are exclusively eating up the top, and you want to target the done and emerger stage of a hatch. So it all depends on what you're trying to, not what you're trying to accomplish, but what the fish are doing. And then again, your goal is to put your flies in front of a fish and make them look natural. So however you choose to accomplish that is fine. The dry dropper is a great way to go. So hopefully that answers your question, Alex. Thanks a bunch for sending it in. Aaron from Utah has our next question, writes in and says, Spencer, I've been binging the podcast and taking lots of notes, but the most intimidating piece of advice I've heard is to look for the active bugs. I just don't see them. I don't know where to look. It doesn't help that I'm almost 50 and can't see. Help. Well, Aaron, you came to the right place for some help. I hope you did anyways. I appreciate you sending your question in. We've actually got a masterclass video on this topic that I highly suggest you watch, and anybody else who might need some help here, watch it. And it can be a lot more helpful to watch than to hear it explained, but I'll still explain. I'll throw a link to that masterclass video in the show notes for you. But the key with looking for the active bugs is you've got to look in a few places when you get to the river. That's going to be around the water, on the water, and in the water. So around the water, what that means is you get to the river and you want to see if there's any bugs buzzing in the air. If there's any bugs flying. When you walk to the river, did you kick up any hoppers? Okay, did you walk over any ants? Are there beetles crawling anywhere? Do you hear cicadas in the trees? Because if you do, then that's going to give you an idea of what flies are available to the fish, and that's what you can tie on for a dry fly. You also want to look on the water, because even if there's a bunch of bugs buzzing in the air, what's actually on the water? Is there a hatch actively going on? Are the fish rising to eat caddis? Are they eating mayflies? Are they eating midges? What are they snacking on? Pay attention to what's on the water as well. Then you also want to look at what's in the water, because if there's nothing around the water and there's nothing on the water, there's always something in the water. So at that point, you're going to pick up some rocks. You're going to turn them over and look at what's crawling underneath the rocks. There are some people who will use those seines, the nets, and they'll stick that in the water, and they'll pull the bugs out of that drift through the water. And that's another great way to do it. I've never needed to use that. I've never felt like that was more or less helpful than just looking under rocks. But if you think that could help, then certainly go for it. It's just not something I've personally done a whole lot of myself. But if you do those three things, if you look around, on, and in the water, you're going to find some bugs by doing that. Now, again, if nothing is around or on the water, then the bugs that you uncover under those rocks are going to be your best bet. So in that situation, that probably means that you are fishing either late or early in the year, so the bugs really aren't that active anyways. And at that point, your scuds, your worms, your zebra midges, your sow bugs, that's a go-to for a lot of people because those are the bugs that are active the most during the winter and that are the most available. This is also where the idea of attractor patterns comes into play. And attractor patterns are exactly what they sound like. They're flies that are tied to really grab a fish's attention, not necessarily to imitate very closely some sort of aquatic insect. Why am I blanking on the name? Rainbow warrior. There we go. My brain just completely went blank there for a second. But the rainbow warrior is a fantastic example of an attractor pattern. It's got the right proportions to look maybe like a midge or maybe like a little mayfly nymph, but it's so bright and flashy that it just grabs a fish's attention, and sometimes they will just smack it because of that. But you could use that attractor pattern, and then you could stick a scud behind it. They're going to see the rainbow warrior. That gets their attention, but then they see the real scud or the scud drifting behind it. They think, ooh, scud, I haven't had one of those in a minute. And they go smack it. You tie into a fish, and that's all she wrote. So that is one way to think about using attractor patterns because there really will be times in the year when the bugs just aren't doing a whole lot. So your attractor patterns can be helpful in those situations. So hopefully that answers your question. I appreciate you sending it in. And with that, folks, we are going to move on to the live real life moment of this week's show. Every week, we end the show by sharing stories and pictures and sometimes even videos of folks from our audience out there living real life. We love to see the pics and hearing your stories. So if you'd like to share your own live real life moment, there is a link to submit those in the show notes. And this week's live real life moment is from Nate. Writes in and says, introduced Dawson to fly fishing this weekend at Bennett Springs State Park in Missouri. We had a blast and she was able to catch 2 on her first trip. On a side note, I witnessed a hatch and observed a change in feeding behavior. On our second evening, fish began to surface. I tied on a dry and started tearing them up. I wouldn't have taken the time to do this had it not been for the podcast. Well, Nate, that's awesome. I'm assuming Dawson's your daughter or something just by looking at the picture that you sent in. But that's fantastic, man. Thanks so much for sharing this story. And you're right. Those little observations that you can make, they really can make the difference in how successful you are out there on the water. So it's great that you got to experience that for yourself and to start building up your library, like we talked about earlier, building up your library of experiences you can draw on the next time you're in a situation like that. So I love this story. Thanks for sending it in. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up this week. Thank you so much for listening. If you've got a question that you would like to submit, there's always a link to do that in the show notes. And if you could, please make sure you rate and subscribe to this wherever you're listening. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can help live a real life. And don't forget, we've got a ton of other awesome content out there as well. There's always links to look at it. So go check that out. And until next week, everybody, get out in the water, have some fun, and live real life.